In the last hour of darkness on the 1st of May, 1982, the men manning the anti-aircraft guns around a small airfield at the eastern edge of the Falkland Islands heard something they had been told they would never hear. It was the sound of a heavy aircraft, low and fast, out over the black water of the South Atlantic. Seconds later, the ground shook. A stick of bombs walked across the airfield in a single diagonal line, and one of them struck the concrete of the only runway and tore a crater in it. When the sun came up over the wreckage and the smoke, the Argentine garrison was left with a question that its own commanders could not immediately answer. Where had it come from? There was no British aircraft carrier close enough to launch a bomber of that size. There was no captured airbase within reach. The nearest piece of ground that flew the British flag and carried a usable runway sat almost 4,000 miles to the north, a volcanic speck near the equator called Ascension Island. By every calculation the Argentine planners had made, and they were competent planners, the airfield at the bottom of the world was simply beyond the range of British bombs. And yet the crater was real. The dead were real. The bomber had come and gone in the dark, and no fighter had risen to meet it. Pause on that question, because this is not really a story about a runway. A runway can be filled in a day, and this one was. This is a story about an assumption. It is a story about how a nation at war decides what its enemy can and cannot do, and what happens when that enemy refuses to accept the limits it has been assigned. It is the story of the longest bombing raid that had ever been flown in the history of the world, a raid that depended on a retiring nuclear bomber, a fleet of aging tankers, a stack of borrowed parts, and a plan so complicated that the men who drew it up were not entirely sure it could be done. This is the story of Operation Blackbuck. To understand why the Argentine command was so stunned by that crater at dawn, you have to understand what the Argentine military believed on the 2nd of April 1982, the morning their forces came ashore and seized the islands they called the Malvinas. They believed that the Falklands, once taken, were effectively unreachable by British air power. This was not arrogance. It was arithmetic, and the arithmetic was sound. The islands lie in the far South Atlantic, roughly 8,000 miles from Britain by the route a task force would have to sail. There was no forward base for the Royal Air Force anywhere near them. The only staging point available to the British was Ascension, and Ascension sat about 3,900 miles from the airfield at Port Stanley. A bomber flying from there would have to cross that vast empty ocean, strike the target, and cross it all again to get home, with no friendly airfield to land at in between and nowhere to divert if anything went wrong. Argentine officers looked at the map and drew the obvious conclusion. Whatever the Royal Navy might do at sea, the land itself was safe. Here is the part that historians find most striking. The British had reached almost exactly the same conclusion. For years, the British defence chiefs had reviewed the world's trouble spots at regular intervals, and the Falklands had always come back with the same grim verdict. They were, in a single word, indefensible. They were too far away and too close to Argentina. When the Royal Air Force first sat down in early April to work out whether it could even reach the islands, its own initial assessment was gloomy. Without a great deal of air-to-air refueling, any aircraft attacking from Ascension would have to land afterwards somewhere on the South American mainland, and in the likely event that neutral countries refused the use of their airfields. Air attacks on the Argentine forces were judged to be, in the assessment's own careful phrase, not feasible. So both sides began from the same premise. The islands were out of reach. The entire psychological force of what followed came from the fact that the British found a way to break a rule that the Argentines had treated as a law of nature and broke it in the very first days of the shooting. It is worth remembering why Argentina had come at all. The dispute over these windblown islands was very old, reaching back to the 1830s, when Britain established the control it had held ever since. By the start of 1982, the military government in Buenos Aires, led by Lieutenant General Leopoldo Galtieri, was in deep trouble at home. Its economy was in crisis, and its people were restless. A swift and popular reconquest of the Malvinas promised to unite the nation behind the junta, and the invasion did indeed bring crowds into the streets in celebration. But it also brought a response the generals had badly misjudged. The United Nations Security Council swiftly demanded an Argentine withdrawal, and Britain, rather than accept the loss, began at once to gather the largest naval task force it had assembled since the Second World War. The junta had gambled that Britain would grumble and, in the end, do nothing. It was the first of several assumptions that would prove fatally wrong. For the Argentine command, the airfield at Port Stanley was the single most important object on the islands. They had renamed the town Puerto Argentino, and they depended on that one strip of concrete as an umbilical cord to the mainland. The military governor was Brigadier General Mario Menendez, appointed to command the Malvinas, South Georgia, and the South Sandwich Islands on the 3rd of April. His garrison would eventually swell to around 11,000 men in and around Stanley, with a further 2,000 or so on West Falkland, figures the British would later record when the surrender came. Transport aircraft flew supplies into that airfield. Its radars watched the sea and the sky for any sign of the approaching British fleet. Whoever controlled that runway controlled the tempo of the whole campaign. The British planners understood this perfectly. Their first assessment of how to retake the islands stated plainly that Argentine use of the Port Stanley airfield and its radars constrained every British operation, allowed the enemy to move and resupply his forces, and kept Argentine morale high. Take the airfield out of the equation, and the whole occupation began to look far more fragile. There was one crucial detail about that runway, and it cut both ways. It was short. It was a fraction of the length of a normal Royal Air Force runway, with limited room to park aircraft. British intelligence judged that, as it stood, it could not operate fast combat jets. The Argentine Mirage fighters, the Skyhawks, the Daggers, and the deadly Super Etendards carrying their sea-skimming missiles, none of them could use it in its current state. That was the good news. The bad news came in the same intelligence report. The Argentines intended to lengthen the runway to 2,000 meters, and if they succeeded, everything changed. Think about what that would mean. If fast jets could operate from Port Stanley itself, they could strike the British task force from close range as it approached, instead of flying to the very limit of their fuel from bases on the mainland hundreds of miles away. A Skyhawk taking off from Stanley, hitting a British ship and landing back at Stanley to rearm was a nightmare that could break the entire operation before the troops ever got ashore. That was the threat the British set out to kill, and that is how a runway at the end of the earth became the target of the longest bombing mission ever flown. The reason this mattered so much came down once again to distance. Argentina's fast jets flew from bases on the southern mainland at Rio Gallegos and Rio Grande, and even these lay some 400 miles from the islands. A Mirage or a Skyhawk making that crossing arrived over the combat zone with only a few minutes of fuel to spare before it had to turn for home. That thin margin was one of the few great advantages the British held. It meant Argentine pilots fought at the very end of their reach, unable to linger, unable to circle and hunt, forced to make a single fast pass and run. Give those same aircraft a working runway at Port Stanley, minutes from the British ships instead of hours, and that advantage vanished overnight. The margin that protected the fleet would have been handed straight to the enemy. This was why a short strip of concrete came to be seen as worth almost any effort to reach. The aircraft chosen for the job was, by 1982, a museum piece in everything but name. The Avro Vulcan was the most dramatic of the three great bombers Britain had built to carry its nuclear deterrent through the 1950s and 60s. With its enormous tailless delta wing and its four thundering Bristol Olympus engines, the Vulcan had been designed for one mission above all others. It was meant to climb above 50,000 feet, fly deep into Soviet airspace, and drop an atomic bomb on a target such as Moscow. It was a high-flying, long-ranging thoroughbred built for the Cold War. For years, the Vulcan had stood at the very front of Britain's nuclear deterrent. Together with its sister aircraft, the Valiant, and the Victor, it formed what was known as the Fifth Force, the fleet of bombers held ready to strike the Soviet Union at a few minutes' notice. Crews sat on alert beside armed aircraft, able to be airborne before an incoming attack could reach them. It was a grim and disciplined vigil, kept year after year through the tensest decades of the Cold War. The Vulcan had been the spearhead of that threat, the aircraft meant to carry the nation's gravest weapon to its target. To take a machine built for so solemn a purpose and send it, loaded with ordinary bombs, to crater a small runway in the South Atlantic was a strange turn of fate. The men who flew it understood that better than anyone. That mission had died long before the Falklands. In 1960, the Soviets shot down an American spy plane, a U-2, flying at extreme altitude, and the whole idea of safety at height collapsed overnight. The bomber force switched to flying low, hugging the ground to slip under enemy radar. Then, in 1969, Britain handed its nuclear deterrent to the Royal Navy and its missile-carrying submarines. and the Vulcan lost the very reason it had been built. It soldiered on for another decade in a conventional and supporting role, but by 1982 it was weeks away from the scrapyard. The unit that trained new Vulcan crews had already closed the previous summer. Most of the squadrons were gone. The three that remained, based at Royal Air Force Waddington in Lincolnshire, were counting down to their own disbandment at the end of June. The Panavia Tornado was coming to replace them. There is an irony in the timing that is hard to miss. The Vulcan was so close to retirement that the whole world supporting it was already being taken apart. Spare parts were being dispersed to other users, hard-won maintenance skills were being run down, and the crews who knew the aircraft best were preparing to move on to other things. The Royal Air Force was, in effect, calling a weapon back from the edge of its own funeral and sending it south to war. The Vulcan offered the Royal Air Force one thing that nothing else in its inventory could offer. It was a genuine long-range heavy bomber, a real bomb truck with the airframe and the load capacity to carry a serious weight of high explosive a very long way. But turning a retiring nuclear machine into a conventional bomber that could actually reach the Falklands required a scramble of improvisation so frantic that it has become one of the most famous engineering rushes in aviation history. Start with the refueling problem, because everything else flowed from it. The Vulcan had been built with an air-to-air refueling probe in its nose, but the capability had fallen out of use for well over a decade. There had simply been no need for it. The pipework was still in most of the airframes, but seals had rotted, valves had seized, and many of the probes themselves had been stripped out and handed to other aircraft. On Good Friday, the 9th of April, Waddington was ordered to prepare a batch of Vulcans for conventional bombing and to bring their long-dead refueling systems back to life. Ground crews worked around the clock. Engineers scoured other stations, scrapyards, and even museum collections for serviceable probes and fittings. Vulcans that had already been retired to museums were cannibalized for their parts so that a handful of others could go to war. When the crews first practiced taking on fuel in the air, they hit a terrifying problem. Fuel gushed from probes that had not seated cleanly and washed back over the cockpit windscreen, blinding the pilots at the exact moment they most needed to see. The solution was pure make-do. Someone fitted 2 little rows of metal deflector plates ahead of the windscreen to throw the spilling fuel away from the glass. It was crude. It was ugly. It worked. Then there was the problem of finding the target at all. A bomber crossing thousands of miles of featureless ocean needed navigation far better than the Vulcan's Cold War equipment could provide. The fix came from the world of airliners. Engineers fitted the Vulcans with a modern inertial navigation system called the Carousel, the same kind of self-contained navigation unit used by passenger jets, with 2 of them installed in each aircraft. Famously, these units were pulled out of Royal Air Force and civilian VC-10 transport aircraft and bolted into the bombers. Now the crew could fly a chain of waypoints across the empty Atlantic with an accuracy the original Vulcan gear could never have managed. Then there was survival. To stand any chance against the Argentine radar-controlled guns and missiles, the Vulcans needed electronic protection, so the crews hung an American-made jamming pod under the wing, a piece of equipment normally carried by the Royal Air Force's Buccaneer strike jets. There was only one place to attach it. Back in the early 1960s, some of these Vulcans had been fitted to carry a cancelled missile called Skybolt, and the old attachment points and wiring for that dead program were still buried in the wings. Those forgotten fittings, left over from a weapon that never entered service, were what made it possible to carry the jamming pod 20 years later. Of the aircraft surveyed, only 5 had the right hardpoints, and it was from those 5 that the raiders were drawn. The bomb bays, long ago converted for nuclear weapons, were rebuilt to carry 21 1,000-pound conventional bombs hung on 3 racks of 7. The crews had almost no time to learn any of this. Air-to-air refueling training began in the middle of April. Night refueling practice started barely a day or 2 after that. Some crews flew south to Ascension, having completed only a single night refueling exercise. Skills that would normally be built up patiently over many months were crammed into about 2 weeks. There was a deeper rust to scrape off as well. For years, the Vulcan force had trained above all for the nuclear mission, and the older art of dropping large numbers of conventional bombs accurately had faded from daily practice. Now the crews had to relearn it in a hurry. They flew to bombing ranges in Britain and practiced again and again, working up the timing and the aiming until a long stick of bombs would fall where it was meant to. They flew low-level sorties across the countryside and out over the sea, rebuilding the feel of handling a heavy aircraft close to the ground at speed. All of it was compressed into a handful of weeks, against a deadline set not by the Royal Air Force, but by the pace of the war itself. None of this improvisation happened by magic. Behind every modification stood engineers and ground crews working themselves to exhaustion. They solved problems that had no manual, fitting equipment that had never been designed to work together, testing and cursing and trying again through long nights on cold Lincolnshire hard standings. Much of what they achieved would normally have taken many months of careful development. They did it in a fortnight because the alternative was to send crews south in aircraft that were not ready. When people speak of the daring of Blackbuck, they usually mean the flying, and rightly so. But the raid was first won on the ground by people whose names never appeared in any headline, armed with spanners and stubbornness and very little sleep. Look at what the Royal Air Force had actually assembled: a nuclear bomber pulled back from the edge of retirement, airliner navigation computers taken from transport jets, a jamming pod borrowed from a naval aircraft, refueling probes robbed from museum exhibits, deflector plates improvised to stop fuel blinding the pilots, and all of it lashed together in a fortnight to fly the longest bombing raid in history. It was a jury-rigged miracle, and it was completely in keeping with the character of the entire British war. It is worth stepping back here, because Blackbuck was not a strange exception to how Britain fought this war. It was the whole war in miniature. When Argentina invaded, Britain had no plan sitting ready for retaking a set of islands 8,000 miles away. The professional head of the Royal Navy, the First Sea Lord, Admiral Sir Henry Leach, went in person to convince a doubtful Prime Minister, Margaret Thatcher, that a task force could be assembled and that it should be, and it was assembled at a speed that still seems barely believable. The aircraft carriers sailed from Portsmouth just 3 days after the invasion. Because Britain's own military shipping was nowhere near enough for an expedition of that size and distance, the government simply requisitioned civilian ships and sent them to war. The great ocean liner Canberra, cruising in the Mediterranean when the crisis broke, was recalled, converted in a couple of frantic days, and sent into the heart of the amphibious landings. The famous Cunard flagship, the QE-2, was taken up to carry thousands of troops south. A container ship was pressed into service to ferry aircraft and helicopters, and was later hit by a missile and sunk, taking most of the task force's heavy-lift helicopters to the bottom with her. Ships built for holidaymakers and cargo were painted grey and sailed into a shooting war because there was nothing else to send. The air war told the same story. The Sea Harrier, a small, slow jump jet flown from the carriers, was pitted against faster Argentine fighters, and armed with the latest American Sidewinder missiles, more than held its own. A vital resupply of those missiles came through Ascension in the middle of May, a quiet contribution from the United States that helped win the air battle without a single headline at the time. And at the center of the whole enterprise sat that one volcanic island near the equator. Ascension was British territory, but its airfield was leased to the United States and run under contract by a civilian airline. Before the war, it was one of the sleepiest airfields on Earth. It had a single long runway, a tiny handful of staff, and saw only a few aircraft every couple of weeks. Within days of the invasion, it became, briefly, one of the busiest airfields in the world, handling hundreds of aircraft movements in a single day. The senior officers who saw it transformed described it as a tremendous piece of improvisation carried out in almost no time at all. That one overloaded runway was the only doorway through which everything had to pass. The Vulcans and, above all, the enormous fleet of tankers they could not fly without. Those tankers did far more than pass fuel. Before a single bomb fell, it was the Victor force that flew the opening move of the whole war. In the third week of April, well before the main landings, Victors ranged far to the south to carry out long radar surveys of the empty ocean around South Georgia, the remote island that a small British force was about to recapture. One of those flights was, at the time, the longest reconnaissance sortie ever flown, a crew straining over their instruments for hour after hour to map the sea for ice and shipping ahead of the assault. The recapture of South Georgia at the end of April gave Britain its first victory of the war and its first foothold in the far south. And it was the patient, unglamorous tanker crews, the same men who would soon feed the Vulcans through the night, who had quietly made it possible. Everything on that island had to be brought in from somewhere else. Ascension grew almost nothing and stored little, and the sheer thirst of the aircraft now gathering there was enormous. Aviation fuel had to be shipped in by sea tanker and pumped ashore, and every gallon a Vulcan or a Victor burned had crossed an ocean to reach it. A single Blackbuck mission drank an amount of fuel that would have seemed absurd in peacetime. The task of simply keeping the aircraft fed and flying was, in its own way, as demanding as the flying itself. There is a pattern in all of this worth naming plainly. Britain in 1982 did not win the ability to strike Port Stanley because it had prepared carefully for exactly this war. It had not. It won that ability because, faced with a problem no one had planned for, it was willing to improvise on a grand scale, to raid its own museums, to bolt together the tools of 3 different eras, and to ask aging crews and aging aircraft to attempt something at the very edge of what was possible. That willingness to make do, to press forward with an imperfect answer rather than wait for a perfect one that would arrive too late, ran through the whole campaign. The task force had sailed before anyone was certain how it would be supplied. Ocean liners went to war as troop ships. A bomber built to end the world was sent to break a runway. None of it was tidy. All of it was fast. And in a war measured in weeks, fast and imperfect beat slow and correct. Now consider the sheer mathematics of the thing, because this is where the impossibility of Blackbuck becomes clear. The Vulcan could reach out perhaps 2,500 miles on its own fuel. Ascension to Port Stanley and back was around 8,000 miles. That gap could only be closed by refueling in the air, again and again. But the Royal Air Force's tankers were themselves converted bombers, the Handley Page Victor, and they suffered from almost exactly the same range limitation as the Vulcan they were meant to feed, so the tankers needed tankers of their own. To push one bomber far enough south to drop its bombs, a whole relay of aircraft had to give fuel to each other in a cascading chain across the ocean. The planning ran up through the highest levels of the Royal Air Force. The professional head of the service, Air Chief Marshal Sir Michael Beetham, himself a bomber pilot in the Second World War, was the key champion of the idea at the top, taking it to the War Cabinet. To work out what was actually possible, the planners handed the problem to a mathematician at the Ministry of Defence, who gathered the numbers he needed, including the exact makeup of the runway surface, obtained from the very British construction firm that had originally built the Port Stanley airfield. From the height the bomber would fly and the strength of that concrete, he could calculate the size of crater a single bomb would make, and from that the ideal number of bombs to carry. The answer that went forward was 21. At Waddington, the station commander recalled an experienced squadron commander to lead the training and planning, and a small group of crews was selected to prepare for the mission. The tanker force came from the Victor squadrons based at Royal Air Force Marham, with 14 of the big tankers moved down to Ascension. Overall command of the air effort belonged to Air Vice Marshal John Curtis, the most senior airman in the operational chain. The refueling plan they devised was a masterpiece on paper and a nightmare in the cockpit. For the first raid, 11 Victor tankers would take off alongside the 2 Vulcans, a primary and a spare. The tankers would refuel the bomber and each other in a great descending staircase of fuel. The ones going furthest south were topped up by the ones turning back sooner, and one by one the tankers peeled away for home as their own fuel ran low, handing the baton to the aircraft still pressing on. As the formation drove south, the chain grew shorter and shorter, until a single last tanker gave the Vulcan its final drink before the target and turned for home with barely enough to survive. People often shorten all this to a memorable phrase: 11 tankers for one bomber. But even that understates the choreography. Counting the return journey as well, it took 18 tanker flights to get one Vulcan to Port Stanley and back. Every single link in that chain had to work, in the dark, in total radio silence over an ocean with no diversion airfield anywhere. To hold formation and pass fuel without a word, the crews used only lights. Red to say not ready or emergency, amber to say the tanker was ready, green to say the fuel was flowing. That was the entire conversation, in colours, in the night. Shortly before midnight on the 30th of April, the aircraft of the first raid began rolling down the Ascension runway one after another, 13 in all, and their navigation lights switched off, climbing away in silence into the dark. In the warm, tropical air, the heavily loaded aircraft were over their design weight, and the engines had to be pushed beyond their normal limits just to get airborne. There were 2 Vulcans in that stream. The designated primary bomber was flown by squadron leader John Reeve. The spare, an aircraft called XM607, was flown by Flight Lieutenant Martin Withers. The plan was for Withers to fly along for the first hour or so and then turn back once the primary had proven itself and taken its first load of fuel. It did not work out that way. Not long after takeoff, the primary Vulcan suffered a failure. The rubber seal around a small cockpit window had perished, and the crew could not pressurize the aircraft. Reeve had no choice but to abort and return to Ascension. In an instant, the spare became the mission. The whole enormous effort now rested on Martin Withers and the crew of XM607. There were 6 men aboard that Vulcan, one more than the aircraft was designed to carry. Alongside Withers sat his co-pilot, Flying Officer Peter Taylor. Behind them, in the darkened cabin, were the 2 navigators, Flight Lieutenant Gordon Graham and Flight Lieutenant Bob Wright, and the Air Electronics Officer, Flight Lieutenant Hugh Pryor, who would manage the jamming equipment. And crammed into a 6th seat that barely existed was Flight Lieutenant Dick Russell, a refueling specialist brought along precisely because the crew's own refueling skills were so new and so untested. Withers later described the moment the truth landed on them, that they were the ones who would be flying all the way to the Falklands to bomb Port Stanley. It came, he said, as something of a shock. But they were ready. They had done the briefings and the training, and they turned south. Then a tanker developed a fault, and its place had to be taken by a reserve. The formation, already burning fuel faster than the planners had forecast, pushed on into worsening weather, and it was in that weather, at the last and most important refueling before the target, that the whole mission nearly died. In heavy turbulence and driving cloud, one Victor was supposed to fill up another Victor, which would then make the final transfer to the Vulcan and turn for home. But as the 2 tankers came together in the storm, the refueling probe on the receiving aircraft snapped clean off. That aircraft could no longer take on fuel, which meant it could neither fly on to give the bomber what it needed, nor be sure of getting home itself. The roles had to be reversed on the spot. The crippled tanker passed what fuel it could to its partner and turned back with its broken probe. That left a single Victor, flown by squadron leader Bob Tuxford to make the final transfer to the Vulcan, but the numbers no longer worked. Giving the bomber enough fuel to reach the target would leave Tuxford himself unable to get back to Ascension without a further refueling that had not been arranged. Tuxford made his decision in the dark and in seconds. He passed the fuel anyway and accepted that he would have to gamble on being rescued somehow on the way home. Even so, the Vulcan came away from that final contact with thousands of pounds less fuel than Withers had been counting on. He was now flying the most important mission of the war with a serious fuel shortage and no room for error. Port Stanley was not undefended. Around the airfield, the Argentines had sighted radar-directed anti-aircraft guns, rapid-firing cannon that could throw up a wall of shells, along with surface-to-air missiles and the radars that guided them. A bomber caught in daylight or held in a searchlight at night would have been in serious danger. Withers had 3 things on his side: the darkness, the jamming pod under his wing, and speed. The plan depended on arriving unannounced, striking once, and being gone before the gunners below could find him. He flew on alone. As he neared the Falklands, he pushed the Vulcan down to around 300 feet to slip beneath the Argentine radar. Then, about 40 miles out, he hauled the great bomber up in a sudden climb to bombing height. The radar locked onto reference points on the coastline, and the automatic bombing system took control. Withers made one final clever decision. Instead of running the length of that narrow runway, where the smallest error left or right would throw the whole stick harmlessly into the sea or the grass, he crossed it at an angle, roughly 30 degrees off the line of the strip, to give the string of 21 bombs the best possible chance that at least one of them would find the concrete. The final aiming fell to the navigators bent over their radar screen in the back of the aircraft. The airfield itself showed only faintly on the display, so they aimed instead using fixed features on the coastline as reference points, letting the bombing computer work out the exact moment of release from those. It was painstaking, precise work, carried out in a handful of seconds, while the aircraft bored in through the dark toward guns that had not yet woken up. Only when the system was satisfied did the weapons begin to fall. In the darkness before dawn, from around 10,000 feet, the Vulcan released all 21 1,000-pound bombs in a single stick, a few seconds of falling steel walking across the airfield. Then Withers threw the huge aircraft into a steep banking turn and ran for the north. One bomb struck the runway squarely near the middle and blew a crater in it. The rest marched across the airfield in a diagonal line, wrecking equipment and stores and killing and wounding Argentine personnel. British accounts generally record 3 men killed on the ground. Sea Harriers from a carrier were held ready to protect the bomber, but no Argentine fighter rose to challenge it. The Vulcan had come and gone almost unopposed. As XM607 climbed away and turned for the long haul home, the crew transmitted a single code word back up the chain to tell everyone, all the way to headquarters, that the mission had succeeded. The word was superfuse. It was picked up and relayed onward through the night, and before long the most senior officers of the Royal Air Force knew that the impossible thing had been done. Remarkably, the outside world learned of it almost as fast. The BBC World Service reported the raid before the bomber and the last of its tankers had even landed back at Ascension, and Bob Tuxford's gamble paid off. Flying home with almost no fuel left and still hundreds of miles short of the island, his crew sent out a distress call. A rescue tanker was launched to find them, and Tuxford took on just enough fuel to land safely. Withers brought XM607 down at Ascension after a flight of nearly 16 hours, having taken fuel from the tankers many times over the course of the journey. It was, by a wide margin, the longest-range bombing raid ever flown to that date, a record that would stand until American B-52s flew from the United States itself during the Gulf War almost a decade later, and even they leaned on tankers positioned along the way. Consider what those hours cost the men who flew them. Nearly 16 hours strapped into a cramped, noisy, shaking cabin, much of it in darkness, most of it over open ocean, with no land in sight and no safe place to come down. There was the constant strain of the refueling contacts, each one a delicate and dangerous piece of flying in its own right, and the knowledge that a single serious failure far from home could mean going into a freezing sea. The crews wore immersion suits against exactly that possibility. They flew on adrenaline, strong coffee, and training. When Withers finally shut down his engines back at Ascension, he and his crew had been pushed close to the limit of human endurance, and they had done it in an aircraft most of the world assumed was fit only for a museum. Withers was awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross. Tuxford, whose split-second decision in the storm had arguably saved the entire operation, received the Air Force Cross. Others in both crews were honored as well. And at first light, Sea Harriers followed up with their own low-level attack on the airfield, adding to the damage and setting a fuel dump ablaze. That 1st of May became the day the air war truly began. Believing the British landings might be starting, the Argentine Air Force threw itself into action, and a series of fierce clashes played out over the islands and the fleet. The Sea Harriers, flying at the very edge of their endurance, met them and came out ahead, drawing first blood in the battle for the sky that would rage on and off for the next 6 weeks. Blackbuck had struck the opening note before dawn. By the time the sun set on that long first day, both sides understood that the war for the Falklands would be decided, in large part, in the air. There was a message in the timing as much as in the bombs. The first raid was flown before the British troops had landed, before the main fleet was even in position off the islands. It was among the very first shots of the whole war. To open a campaign 8,000 miles from home by reaching all the way to the enemy's newest prize and striking it in the dark was a declaration of intent. It told the watching world that Britain was serious, that it would not simply protest and then withdraw, and that no target it chose to reach was truly beyond its grasp. For a nation that had surprised even itself by sending a fleet south, that was a powerful thing to say on the very first morning. The first raid is the one everyone remembers, but it was only the beginning. There were 7 planned Blackbuck operations in all. 5 were actually flown to completion. 3 of those were bombing raids, and 2 were sent to hunt Argentine radars with anti-radar missiles. The second raid followed just days later, flown by the same aircraft, XM607, this time captained by John Reeve and his crew, once again loaded with 21 bombs. The refueling went more smoothly, but to avoid the Argentine guns now fully alert, the bomber ran in higher than before. This time, the bombs fell to the side of the runway, damaging the edges of the airfield and parked aircraft rather than cutting the strip itself. The third raid, planned as another bombing mission, was cancelled before takeoff when strong headwinds and bad weather made the fuel plan impossible. The fourth raid marked a change. Instead of iron bombs, the Vulcan would now carry American anti-radar missiles designed to home in on the beam of an enemy radar and destroy it. Squadron leader Neil McDougall and the crew of XM597 were several hours out when a supporting tanker's refueling equipment failed, and the mission had to be recalled. The fifth raid, flown at the end of May, saw McDougall and XM597 complete that first anti-radar mission. Carrying missiles rather than a heavy bomb load, the lighter Vulcan could take extra fuel and needed fewer refuelings. MacDougall had to loiter over the target area for the best part of an hour, trying to tempt the big Argentine surveillance radar into staying switched on long enough for a missile to lock onto it. The result was only a partial success. The radar was reportedly back in action within a day or so. The sixth raid is the second most famous, and for good reason, because it turned into a drama all its own. MacDougall and the crew of XM597 flew south again, this time carrying 4 anti-radar missiles. The Argentines kept their main surveillance radar switched off to protect it, so to draw the enemy out, MacDougall loitered over the target for around 40 minutes and finally flew directly over the airfield to provoke a gun-laying radar into switching on. It worked. The crew fired their missiles and destroyed an Argentine fire control radar, killing 4 of its operators. But on the way home, disaster struck. During refueling, the Vulcan's own probe was damaged and broke. Unable to take on fuel and unable to reach ascension, MacDougall was left with 2 options: ditch in the freezing ocean or divert to neutral Brazil. He turned for Rio de Janeiro. One of the 2 remaining missiles was thrown into the sea to reduce drag. The other jammed on its rail and could not be released. The crew pushed sensitive documents out of the aircraft, sent a distress call, and were cleared to land at Rio with almost no fuel left, not even enough for a second attempt at the runway. The aircraft and its crew were interned by the Brazilian authorities and held for about a week, treated, by all accounts, rather well. The stuck missile was confiscated by Brazil and never returned. Through some quiet diplomacy, the aircraft and men were released and flew back to Ascension, on the condition that the aircraft take no further part in the war. It is worth understanding why these radar hunting missions mattered at all. The Argentine surveillance radar at Stanley was the eye that watched for approaching British aircraft, and every attack the Harriers flew was made more dangerous by it. If that eye could be blinded, or even frightened into staying switched off, British aircraft could operate with a little more freedom and a little less risk. That was the real prize the anti-radar Vulcans were sent to win. They never destroyed the main radar outright, but by forcing the Argentines to think twice before switching it on, and by knocking out one of the fire control sets that aimed the guns, they added their weight to the slow strangling of the airfield's defenses. It was a supporting role, played at extreme range, and it cost 1 aircraft and its crew a week's internment in Brazil to perform. The 7th and final raid ended the campaign where it had begun, with Martin Withers and XM607. This last mission was aimed at Argentine positions around the airfield, in support of the British troops now closing in on Stanley, and it deliberately spared the runway, which the British expected to need for their own aircraft once the islands were recaptured. In the event, a fusing error meant the bombs did not perform as intended and the stick fell wide. It hardly mattered. 2 days later, Menendez surrendered his garrison and the war was over. That 7th raid was the last combat mission ever flown by a Royal Air Force heavy bomber, and there is a further truth that gives the whole story its strange weight. In the entire long career of the Avro Vulcan, from the middle of the 1950s to its retirement, these raids were the only time it ever dropped bombs in anger. A machine built for a war that thankfully never came fired its only shots in a small, sharp conflict at the far end of the Earth, decades after it was designed and just weeks before it was due to be retired forever. Few weapons have ever waited so long for so brief a moment in action, so the obvious question hangs in the air. Was any of it worth it? This is where an honest telling has to slow down and be fair, because the value of Blackbuck is one of the most argued questions of the entire Falklands War, and the answer depends entirely on what you think the raids were actually for. Take the case against them first, because it is a strong one. By the cold arithmetic of bombing, the results look thin. Across 3 bombing raids, the Vulcans dropped 63 bombs, and exactly 1 of them cratered the runway. Argentine engineers filled that crater within about a day, using earth and rubble, and kept the strip usable for their transport aircraft and their light attack planes. The runway was never actually closed. Argentine transports kept flying supplies in and casualties out until nearly the end of the war. The defenders even built fake craters, heaps of earth on the surface, to fool British reconnaissance into thinking the strip was more damaged than it was. The airlift itself became a quiet epic of the Argentine side. Their transport crews kept flying into Port Stanley by night, slipping past the British ships and fighters to bring in supplies and carry out the wounded, right up until the last days before the surrender. The runway the British had cratered stayed open to those brave and stubborn flights to the very end. The sharpest critic wore a British uniform. Commander Nigel Ward, who led a squadron of Sea Harriers from one of the carriers, thought the whole Vulcan effort was a wasteful attempt by the Royal Air Force to muscle into what was really a naval war. He worked out that the vast quantity of fuel needed to put 21 bombs on Port Stanley could instead have flown hundreds of Sea Harrier bombing missions over the same target, delivering many times the weight of bombs. And what, he asked, had all that fuel actually bought? A crater filled in within a day and perhaps one radar knocked out. As for the famous claim that the raids frightened Argentina into pulling its best fighters back to defend its capital, Ward dismissed it flatly as propaganda. Now take the case in favour, because it too is serious, and it is made not only by the Royal Air Force but by careful historians since. To judge Blackbuck by counting how many bombs hit the runway, the argument runs, is to misunderstand the mission entirely. Start with the runway itself. The point was never really to destroy it. The point was to stop it being made longer. The moment the British proved they could reach that airfield and crater it, and could clearly come back and do it again, the Argentines dared not commit the heavy engineering effort and the many weeks it would take to extend the strip to handle fast jets. Martin Withers made exactly this point himself. It was vital, he said, to put that runway out of action, because if aircraft like the Skyhawks could have used Stanley as a forward base, they could have flown out to hit the British ships from close range. That threat never materialized. The nightmare scenario simply never came to pass. Then there is the wider message. Air Vice Marshal John Curtis, who commanded the air campaign, had no doubt the raids were worth it, and especially the first. It sent a stark message to Argentina, he said. If the Royal Air Force could reach the Falklands, it could reach the Argentine mainland too. And here the defenders point to something telling. Argentine sources themselves indicate that their Mirage fighters were held back to defend the homeland against the possibility of exactly such an attack. Fighters kept at home to guard the capital were fighters not escorting the bombers that came after the British fleet. Modern studies of the campaign conclude that striking the airfield was a central and deliberate part of the joint plan to retake the islands, not some vanity project by an air force looking for glory. Those same studies are scrupulously honest, though, and they admit freely that only one bomb ever cratered the runway. There is one more twist that both sides tend to acknowledge. Whatever fear of a mainland attack the raids created was deliberately undercut by the British themselves. For sound political reasons, British officials made clear that they would not bomb targets on the Argentine mainland. Once that assurance was understood, the threat that made Argentina hold its fighters at home lost much of its force. The fair verdict lies somewhere in the middle. As a simple exercise in cratering a runway, Blackbuck was extravagantly expensive for a very modest physical result, and the critic's arithmetic is hard to dismiss. But as a strategic and psychological stroke, delivered at the very opening of the war, it achieved things that a bomb count cannot measure. It helped ensure the runway was never extended. It played a part in keeping Argentine fighters tied to home defense. And it announced to the enemy and to the world that British reach and British will were greater than anyone had assumed. The truth is that we will probably never fully separate how much the enemy's caution owed to Blackbuck and how much to other pressures, and an honest account should simply say so. There is a cost to name here that has nothing to do with strategy. The raids consumed a huge share of the Royal Air Force's entire tanker fleet, the real unsung heroes of the whole affair. The victors flew hundreds of sorties across the campaign from the first day to the last. It was a victor that flew the very first British operational mission of the war, a marathon radar survey of the seas around South Georgia, flown days before the bombing campaign had even begun. The fuel bills for Blackbuck were staggering, and the exact figures are still argued over. But whichever number you choose, the essential truth is the same. It took an entire armada of the air to put one bomber over one runway, and yet, across all 7 Blackbuck operations, not a single aircraft was lost, and not a single crewman was killed. The closest calls were the diversion to Rio and Bob Tuxford's fuel-starved crawl home through the night. For an operation of such reach and such risk, flown by aging aircraft held together with borrowed parts, that record is close to miraculous. What became of the men and the machines is worth setting down plainly, once and then leaving to stand. Martin Withers, who flew the first raid and the last, stayed in the Royal Air Force and later flew as a commercial airline pilot. In time, he became the chief pilot of the trust that kept the very last airworthy Vulcan flying at air shows for admiring crowds, a fitting second life for the man who had flown the type on its most famous mission. Bob Tuxford, the tanker captain whose courage in the storm saved the first raid, went on to write his own account of that night. Neil McDougall, who flew the demanding anti-radar missions and brought his crippled bomber down safely at Rio, carried out some of the hardest flying of the whole campaign. John Reeve, whose aircraft had to turn back on the first raid through no fault of his own, flew the second raid in its place, and Mario Menendez, the Argentine governor who surrendered his garrison in the middle of June, returned home to Argentina and lived out the rest of his life there. The aircraft themselves became relics of a particular kind. XM-607, the Vulcan that made history over Port Stanley, was retired at the end of that year and set up as a gate guardian at its home station of Waddington in Lincolnshire, where it stands today, perhaps the most historically important survivor of its kind anywhere in the world. XM-597, the bomber of the Rio adventure, is preserved in Scotland, still wearing the small painted marks that record its Blackbuck missions. The Vulcan itself left Royal Air Force service entirely a couple of years after the war. The faithful Victor tanker soldiered on for another decade and went to war one final time in the Gulf. And the war Blackbuck opened was, of course, far larger than one bomber. The Sea Harriers bore the weight of the air battle and won it. British troops fought their way ashore and then across the island in the cold and the wet, yard by yard, until the Argentine surrender at Stanley in the middle of June brought it to an end. Blackbuck was a single thread in that much larger cloth, but it was the thread that reached the furthest, which brings us back to the crater at dawn and to the assumption that made it so shocking. The Argentine belief was not foolish. It was built on sound reasoning and hard geography, and by every ordinary measure the Falklands should have been beyond the reach of British bombers. Argentina built its confidence on that near certainty. What its planners had not counted on was a country willing to drag a nuclear bomber back from the scrapyard, rob its own museums for spare parts, borrow navigation computers from airliners, and thread 11 tankers through a midnight storm, all to place a single bomber over that runway for a few short seconds and prove a point. The crater was filled in a day. The point never was. On that first morning of May, one word carried back across the ocean and told London and told Buenos Aires that the map they had all been reading was wrong. If Britain could reach Port Stanley, it could reach anywhere it chose. A limit that had felt as solid as the stone of the earth turned out to be nothing more than an assumption, and assumptions can be broken. That is why the story still holds us, more than 40 years on. Not because of the damage it did, which was slight, not because it won the war on its own, which it did not. It holds us because of the belief it shattered, and because of what a small band of determined people were willing to attempt when everyone, on both sides, had already agreed it could not be done. If your father, your grandfather, or someone you loved flew in those bombers or those tankers, or worked through those frantic nights at Waddington or Marham to make aging aircraft ready for war, their part in this deserves to be remembered, and I would be glad to hear their name. Because in the end, the reach of that single aircraft in the dark was really the reach of every hand that sent it there.